Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm looking forward to this chat. Iggy Monda, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Good morning.
Good morning. You're joining us from New York City?
New York, Brooklyn, New York,
Brooklyn,
Cypress
New York.
Hills,
Sorry?
Cypress Hills
Cypress
in
Hills.
Brooklyn.
Okay. Very cool. I'm located in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. And Iggy, your producer, reporter, and host of a new podcast called Roughhousing. Folks, you got to hear this podcast. Only episode 1 is out, but it explores the topic of hazing in youth sports. It's a tough subject, obviously, but an important one to talk about. So make sure you go and get this podcast right away. It's available wherever you get your podcast. Iggy, first question for you. Tell us about roughhousing and why you wanted to explore the topic of hazing in youth sports.
Oh, thanks for asking the question, and thanks for the plug. I mean, a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, a friend by the name of Jacques Norpo, who's also like a documentarian, also a comedian, he told me about this story that happened in Alabama, which is the story basically that you hear in episode 1. Jacques Nor and his family were friends with the Kims, and he told me about what happened to Rodney Kim Jr. And I never heard about this case, and I never really thought of hazing too much. Like, hazing really has its preconceptions where when you hear the word hazing, usually for me, it goes into military or Greek life or possibly even Hollywood movies, such as, The Dazed and Confused, the School Days by Spike Lee, the old schools. You don't really think about a 14-year-old kid on a football team just wanting to be Tom Brady, wanting to be Patrick Mahomes, wanting to play for the varsity team, and then getting jumped and losing his entire dream. And that just kind of led me down this giant rabbit hole of just looking for more stories like Rodney's. I wanted to go deeper into Rodney's story, but I also wanted to know how prevalent this is. The interesting thing about that is that there's no CDC, there's no FBI, there's no database that really covers this. There's really one man named Hank Newer who's a historian of hazing, who's done a lot of, he has his own like collection of hazing cases, but they don't really focus on high school. He has a high school page, but they're not that many, and they don't really deal with sports. So I created my own. I created my own database of right now, I think we have over 300 cases that I could find, whether through lawsuits or through old newspapers or through new releases, media releases, I mean. And it's just, the more prevalent I kept seeing it happen, like the more I saw it happening, there was a certain point where I was creating like Google alerts, and let's say it would be the fall, like right when school was starting for kids in high school, I would probably find at least one new case a week of some type of hazing happening in high schools in America, specifically in the United States. There were cases in other countries, but I thought that would have been too far of a reach for me to do, basically, and the team. But I just fell down this rabbit hole for a year and a half to 2 years and just still haven't come out of it. I hope that answered the question.
Oh yeah, no, you answered it there, and I have to just tell you why I really got hooked to episode 1 and this series. It's just hearing from this athlete, hearing from his family. You really do quite a job in capturing the range of emotions that are felt, and that really hooked me in. And of course, it's a very frustrating and sad topic, but it's an important one to discuss, because we're seeing the topic of safe sport being, is being talked about, I know, in this country and all over the world, and the topic of hazing and how that impacts athletes is, I think, is part of that discussion. I'd like to know, how does hazing affect young athletes and their families, and how widespread is the culture of hazing in sports?
For sure. I mean, the thing you have to really think about is just, one, how do people look at hazing? And I talked about the preconceptions of hazing before, but if you go to an athlete, go to like a college athlete or a high school athlete, or even someone in like fraternities or whatever, if you ask them, what are your thoughts on hazing? A lot of people won't say anything negative about it, or they'll try to kind of reject it, like, oh, we don't do hazing, we do something else. We do something like the title of the show, roughhousing. We horseplay, we wrestle, we're just kids being kids. We don't do that. We don't do hazing, quote unquote. And that's kind of what episode 2 is about. Once you hear it. And also, thank you for being a listener. Thank you for being a fan. But it basically, the question we're going to ask in episode 2 is, can hazing ever just be fun? And is there a line? So can hazing ever just be fun, or will it always cross this line that just goes too far, like what we saw with Rodney? Because Rodney's case isn't the first time that something like that happened at his school, at Davidson High School. But no one else either complained, or no one else was just went to the media or went to the coach or to their parents, or no one like spoke out about it as much. Now Rodney was kind of forced into a position to speak out about it. He actually didn't want to at first.
Right.
But I mean, when you have broken bones, and as you could hear from the first episode, clearly mental trauma, it's something that was he was forced into that position. He didn't want to be the face of hazing. Now, as to how prevalent it is in the country, it happens everywhere. I in the database that I try to construct, I try to look at multiple different variables and multiple different factors. I try to look at public schools versus private schools versus Catholic schools. I try to look at suburban area versus rural area versus urban. And even the experts I spoke with, people that have focused on this topic longer than I have, everyone will tell you, and I can basically say this, there's no real demographic. There's not like this one place with this one group of people they're going to do it more. I can tell you specific things about it. I can tell you like some sports from my database, I could tell like the more physical sports you're probably going to see hazing more. So the footballs, the wrestling, maybe even some hockey. You'll see it on basketball teams and baseball teams. You even see it on, it's not, also the other thing that I want to stress is it's not just a male thing. Like there's a lot of female teams that have hazing too. One of the episodes we're going to talk about is strictly going to be on a dance team in Oregon. And we're going to see the community reaction. And that's the thing also that I would love to stress is that hazing is usually short-lived, like the actual hazing experience. Sometimes, like, let's say you're pledging a frat or a sorority. You have to do like certain pledge events, maybe every day or once a week or whatever. Maybe on a high school team, like with Rodney, you have to go through this one time, and then you're like accepted into the team, or maybe you're just like cool with the team or cool with your players. But the problem is when something crosses the line, like I brought up before, like with Rodney, the aftermath of the hazing is actually what sticks with them. The aftermath lasts longer. And usually when hazing happens, you're going to see this later on in episode 4. When the hazing happens, there's this one expert that called this the second hazing, which is when the community basically, and I hope I'm using their words correctly, but it's basically when the community reacts, because the community is like, why are you coming out with this news? One, why are you snitching? And two, we're the victims because you're trying to break the status quo. We always used to do this. This is always tradition. Or they'll be like, oh, why are you messing with the team? Like the team was winning, or this is just a team that we love to go see on Friday nights or whatever. And now you're coming out with news, like page 6 type news, and just messing with the team camaraderie. The coach might have gotten fired. People might have been suspended. We're not going to be as good. So why are you doing this to us? So the community, and this doesn't happen every time, but it can either be the school community, the students, it can be the school itself, or it can be the town itself that feels like they're the ones that are victimized. And then they ostracize the kid that either came out or the family that comes out with the news. Wow. So the whole, it becomes really ironic in a sense, because the whole point of hazing, in a sense, is bonding and camaraderie. At least that's what they say. There's other reasons that I can go into, but they say, oh, we're going to do this because we're trying to be closer with you, or we think that we're cool now, so like I can like mess around with you. In the end, though, sometimes these cases do the exact opposite effect, where you exile the person that you were trying to haze. So when you were trying to bond with this person actually becomes more of a like otherized, I guess, in a sense.
Wow. So it's almost like they're re-traumatizing the individual and the family by ostracizing them. And it's, you know, it sounds like you've really done a lot of research into this. Obviously, you created a database. I'm curious to know, and I don't want to get, I do have a set of questions here, but are you planning to do, after the series is done, are you planning to write write articles about it, or maybe extend this into a documentary format? Because it sounds like there are so many stories, and you clearly have a passion for this. It comes out in the episode as you're telling us the story. Are you planning to do more with the subject matter?
Well, I'll say this first. I'd never, going into this, I never expected to be a hazing expert. And I don't know if I should call myself a hazing expert, but I know a lot more about hazing than I ever did prior to working on this or starting look into this 2 years ago. Do I want to do other stuff with it? I originally pitched this story, Roughhousing, as both a podcast to Religion of Sports as well as working with their unscripted team, which is like the documentary video side team. And the guy, some of the people on the video side were really, really interested. They wanted to see how far we could go into this before they could make it to video. So they're still interested in making this into like either a video series or documentary, whether it's strictly about the Kims or hazing in general. So there were talks about that. And I would be open to writing about this in the future. And I'm definitely going to keep in touch with people, as well as I'm probably going to have to keep the database going. I don't think I could just let it go, honestly. I'm going to share it actually, hopefully today or tomorrow with they make it public. I wanted to just clean it up a little bit before I shared it with everybody. Awesome. And we took out some other like categories that didn't matter, like the suburban, rural, urban, because like there wasn't really a demographic for it. But yeah, I would love to continue working on hazing. Hopefully it's not the only thing that I focus on. I hope it's not my only beat, but I've definitely gone in this rabbit hole and haven't gotten out. And we've definitely talked to the video side of Religion of Sports, ROS. And I know that some people there are really interested in working on it. There was one thing that this might be a little bit of a spoiler for the series, and I hope that's okay with you. But the Kims have a lawsuit against Davidson, for example. And one of the things that we wanted to do was end the series with the lawsuit ending, because the lawsuit was supposed to end last year in March.
Okay.
And then their case got dismissed, so it's currently in appeal.
Oh wow.
The judge dismissed their case. And I'm not going to tell you the reason why, but it's going to be a reason that might infuriate you, because it definitely infuriated me, especially as a minority. But the point is, we wanted to end the series there, like on a perfect like bow tie right there, and the video team wanted to end it there because it got appealed. We're trying to see like a different ending for possibly that video side, but we do have I think a really good landing place where we do end episode 6, which is the last episode for the series.
Very, very exciting stuff, man. And I gotta say, I've been dabbling with Chat GPT. I'm sure you have as well, artificial intelligence. And I if you don't mind, I asked it some questions, and I'd like to share something with you here. I asked Chat GPT, can you give us examples of hazing culture in youth sports in America? Provide a short list in bullet format, written simple language. And then I also asked the follow-up question. Also, how can we differentiate between hazing in sports in America and other rites of passage in American culture? So the answers I got as examples of hazing culture in youth sports in America. The first point was making new team members perform embarrassing or degrading acts, as wearing humiliating costumes or doing painful physical activities. Second point, requiring new members to consume excessive amounts of alcohol or participate in dangerous hazing rituals. And the third one, this one's interesting, initiating new members by forcing them to endure physical or emotional abuse or bullying by older members of the team. And then just the last portion here, where we differentiate between hazing in sports in America and other rites of passages, quote unquote, in American culture. Rites of passage in American culture are typically voluntary, and involve positive experiences such as graduation ceremonies or religious rituals. The second point, hazing, on the other hand, is often coercive, humiliating, and potentially harmful, with the goal of intimidating or ostracizing new members of a group. Hazing can also be characterized by a lack of consent, where new members are forced or pressured to participate in activities that they may not be comfortable with or that violate their rights or values. What do you think of all that?
The interesting thing about those definitions, I've heard all of those definitions, and the interesting thing is there's a lot of different experts of hazing that have very slightly different definitions to hazing, whether it doesn't matter if it's coerced or not, or if you volunteer or not into it. Like, for example, if you're in fraternities or sororities, you're volunteering to get hazed. Like, the pledge process is coming, so you're volunteering, but it's still hazing. But in some other experts will say, no, if you are coerced in it, that's the only thing that matters, then it's hazing. If you are volunteering and it's not hazing, it's just a rite of passage, we have to get a different word to it. So there are some different types of definitions to it. And that brings me back to like episode 2, the next episode. There's a lot of people you'll hear, like the very get-go, we start off the episode with people within the Davidson locker room on the team, whether they were there that day or not. people on the team that said, no, that's not hazing, because they have a different definition of hazing in their head. It was like hazing. Like I asked I asked everybody what's their definition of hazing, and there would be some kids that said, oh, it's like some of the definitions you said, like, oh, it's coerced, it's organized, it's tradition. And they're like, we weren't doing a tradition. We were just playing around in the locker room. Yeah, that locker room play happened all the time, or a good amount of the time, but we didn't consider it like organized or anything like that. But a lot of other experts would say, no, it doesn't matter if it's organized. One expert literally called it semantics. You're just like playing around with words at that point. It really, like, there's always going to be this confusion. And one of the things that people always, I think the greatest comparison in words is bullying versus hazing, because people say, like, oh, that's not, like, some people will hear some of these stories and be like, oh, that's not hazing, that's just bullying. There is I would say hazing and bullying are like cousins. They're very similar, but they have one stark difference. Bullying is like a group of people or one person ganging up on one person to try to isolate him. Hazing is a group of people or one person ganging up on a person to try to bond with them, to try to bring them into something like that rite of passage. That's like the clearest, like starkest difference I could see between those two. There's a lot of different definitions of hazing, but basically, from what I can tell, it's if you go into a process, whether it's organized or not, whether you volunteer or not. Like Rodney didn't volunteer for that. Rodney just got jumped one day. He heard about rumors, he heard about other people. There's also been stories from before Davidson, but over a dozen of his teammates jumped him. Like he didn't want to be jumped. He didn't want to, like, break bones. But his teammates did that because they do that with other kids, and he was just talking a lot of trash. So they thought, oh, if you're going to talk all this trash, then I'm going to try to do the same things I do with all my other teammates. So like there's a lot of semantics you can go into with that word. One case I want to bring up that didn't go into the episode 2 or the series, which I thought was really interesting, was there's this case in Ohio, I think Sandusky, Ohio, with Perkins High School, where the coach got fired for hazing, or for allowing hazing on the team. But if you look into the details, it was actually one of the rare cases where it doesn't look like hazing. It doesn't look like anything happened. I could go into details about it, but it looks like someone used the word to try to get that coach out, basically. Oh, wow. But that creates like this whole like different idea of like, what is hazing then? What does it mean to cross that line? And I at first kept asking people the question of what would be crossing the line? What would make it hazing? And through all this research and through all the interviews, I think that question started changing, or that idea started changing into, rather than what is the line, it would be everyone has their own personal line. I have probably a different line than you have. There's cases that you'll hear. We talk mostly about 4 cases in this series, and each case is very different from the other. But maybe some of those people would have been okay with some of the other things that happened, and maybe some people would have been crossed my line no matter what. It can be humiliation, it could be assault, and there's a lot of cases right now that are coming out that are also sexual hazing. I would say sexual assault hazing is always crossing a line. Some people would say that assault hazing is sometimes okay, sometimes a fight club, sometimes you organize it. So there's rules. Why is that not okay if no one gets hurt? But then what if that one kid gets hurt? Like, that's all it takes. Because the thing with hazing cases, the thing with hazing stories, they're never the first story. They're never the first incident. They're just the story that came out.
It's part of the culture. It's potentially part of the culture. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. You never know about when it started.
All right.
You just know that when it got bad, or when that one case went too far, basically.
And before we dive deeper into it, I think for folks who haven't listened to episode 1 titled Hell Week, can you kind of give us a brief summary of Rodney Kim Jr. and the violent attack that he encountered back in 2018?
Absolutely. Rodney Kim Jr. was a 14-year-old kid. He's now 19. He was a 14-year-old kid in Moby, Alabama, went to Davidson High School. He was a quarterback, but he was really playing defensive. At the time, he was playing defensive back for the freshman team, just because they played a different offense to his pocket passing, from what it seems. But essentially, during spring training, spring practices, all the football players were practicing together, and he was practicing with the quarterbacks. And one day, over a dozen of his teammates jumped him. Like he said, he heard rumors. He said a week before that, he told his parents that, oh, there's another kid that got jumped. And his mom told him, don't get involved in anything like that. Stay away from all that violence. But it wasn't really his choice. one day a dozen or more of his teammates jumped him, broke his wrist, hurt his back, gave him a possibly concussion. I don't remember that exactly, and now he has PTSD. And the doctors advised him. I looked at the medical files. They advised him to not play contact sports because they told the parents that it could paralyze him, like the spine could get further damaged.
Wow.
And this all happened. And the teammates I spoke with some of the perpetrators, some of the kids that actually jumped Rodney. And they said the reason we went after Rodney specifically is because he was talking trash throughout the spring practices. Now, is that the reason is that the only reason they jumped him? No, but I think that's the reason why they picked him next as the next kid to go after. But yeah, he was a 14-year-old freshman that just wanted to play football on his team and wanted to make the varsity team and was confident. And all his life, he was told that he was going to be this great athlete. He was always told that he's going to be this amazing athlete. And maybe he would have been, but he was 14. So Who's to say what he would? It doesn't really matter if he would have been the next NFL star. What matters is he was a 14-year-old freshman that never got the chance because the hazing went too far that day. Yeah, and there's a video of it. I would recommend not watching it if you like. It's violent. It is like a really short Snapchat 30-second video, but yeah, it's brutal. It's just a brutal beating, and a lot of the kids I talk to do regret that it happened, but they don't think. That's the interesting thing is I don't want to spoil the rest of the series, but there's some kids that feel like the only reason he got hurt was because he was too small or he was talking trash that day. And maybe that's why we were more like passionate about like our hits. But I don't think that really matters. Like some of the kids do regret it. The two kids I talked to do regret it that it happened, but I don't think they're as apologetic as much as like regret that they might have gotten in trouble as much. One of the kids I think would be more regretful because he also couldn't play football for the rest of his life. And he was like a 6'3", 230-pound linebacker. He was like an actual guy that could have been a real prospect. But yeah, sorry if that was a tangent, but basically 14-year-old kid, freshman, got hazed and can never play football again for the most part because what happened to him on the football field or in the field house.
Right. He suffers like long permanent damage essentially. But there's the physical and then there's the emotional when we speak of PTSD. And you could hear it in his voice. You could hear the rage, the frustration.
He's damaged. He's very much damaged. And like you said, physical and mental and emotional. Like he was telling me when he does push-ups, you could still hear like the click in his wrist. So there's that still like it still hurts him there. But that's not as much like the physical damage is real, and there's stuff he still had to do rehab for. But like some of the stuff he says in the first episode, like when we had to try to cut down a lot of the stuff because we weren't sure how an audience would take hearing that he could understand why school shooters exist. Like I'm not sure how you had to. I don't know. I'm not sure how you like took in that information, but he basically said I can understand getting a gun and going to a school.
Right.
Because like and to be honest, like me personally, I would want revenge too. If what happened to Rodney happened to me, I can understand wanting revenge. Now at the same time, I understand eye for an eye, but eye for bodies is a different thing. He was really damaged. He got his dreams taken away. He got his friends friends or teammates that he thought were supposed to be close with him, supposed to be protecting him, supposed to be his brothers, at least on the football field, like basically betraying him. And then also the other thing that people don't consider, along with the damage of actually being beat down, people were talking, like this is the modern age, people were talking about him, talking trash about him on social media. People were talking about him incessantly on the news. People in his neighborhood would be talking about him. And the whole time, the school wouldn't give his family answers. And the school were basically trying to brush this away. Like you heard at the end of the episode, I tried, to be fair to Mr. Fred Riley, the head coach there, I tried to talk to him. I tried to reach out to him. I even reached out to him again right before the episode came out. I never got, even to his lawyers, I never got an answer back. But from what the Kims tell me, they went to the school the very next Monday. And as you heard, they said, Riley said, that's not hazing. We just call that roughhousing. We just let that be. And it's just, they just couldn't get answers. He kept getting humiliated and talked down upon. at his school, even the school he's transferred to, because he transferred to another school. He said he was getting bullied there because he was still being considered a snitch and still being considered soft. And just imagine being continuously harassed, continuously or being reminded of this moment that's his lowest moment in his life. Like, and having that like physical pain, and also not being able to follow his dreams anymore, which his parents his entire life told him, you're going to be the next star.
Right, right.
That
And he's only
must be
14.
hard. He was only
Absolutely.
14.
At such a young age to experience
I mean, think about
all
what
of
high
that.
school is supposed to be. High school is
Right.
supposed to be your coming of age. You're like, I mean, you're going through puberty, but you're also trying to find out who you are a little bit more. Like people say that
Mhm.
about college, but before you get to college, you're trying to see, how can I be the adult that's ready for college? How could, what is, like, some people have plans about what they're going to be. I knew I was wanted to be a journalist in high school. I knew that I love sports in high school. That's when you're just learning to become on your own. You're becoming more independent. You're starting to chase that dream. And he lost that in the spring of his freshman year at 14. Like, that has to be hard.
It's devastating, man. And I'd like to know, in terms of, he didn't open up to his mom. It took, I think, 2 days or something like that before he opened up and he told her exactly what happened. Curious to know, what role does silence play in making hazing more difficult to address? And why do
Yeah.
you think there's so much silence and a stigma to talk about it openly, with parents and the community as a whole?
So there's this term, you've probably heard of it, at least with other stuff. It's called the code of silence. Like, that's a real thing with hazing. There is a code of silence. One of the experts, Susan Lipkins, talks about the code of silence probably the most with me, at least. People do not talk about it. Like, even like I told you with Rodney at first didn't want to go to the news. He didn't want to tell his parents, like you just said. He didn't want, like, he wanted to keep playing football. He thought he still had a chance to keep playing. And he thought he had a chance to still be teammates with people. But then he saw people talking trash about him. Then he saw, like, that he couldn't play football again. And that's what led him to this moment. But not a lot of people have that. Again, we only know about Rodney's incident because it came out of the news. There's a lot of people that were hazed at Davidson, at other schools around the country, that don't come out with this news. There was one case I'll tell you about. We didn't get to talk about this in the story. Norwood High School in Colorado, where it was a wrestling team, and the two wrestlers hazed his other teammate. The two wrestlers were the sons of the head coach of the wrestling team.
Wow.
So the hazers were the son of the head coach. At the same time, the guy that they hazed was the son of the principal, I believe.
Wow.
And the community, when they came out with this news, the community supported the hazers, the perpetrators, and the coach, rather than the principal of the school and his son. The principal and his son literally moved 200 miles away just to get away from the retaliation, because they broke that code of silence. So people would rather stay silent for multiple reasons: fear of retaliation, like the example I just told you, fear of retaliation, or they just want to, like, be accepted and they just want to allow it to happen, so, like, they can just move on to the next thing. And then eventually they become the perpetrators themselves. It's a cycle. Like, you start off as usually the victim, and then you move on to a bystander and you're watching this. And then sometimes you also become that perpetrator that does it to the next round of kids under you, because either you want to establish your authority or your place on the totem pole on the team or in the class, or you want to get revenge for what happened to you. So you probably escalate the acts a little bit more. Or it's just how it's always been done. But you keep quiet about it because that's how it's always been done, or you don't want that retaliation. There's a lot of different aspects that go into it. The code of silence is a real thing. That's why I can only find 300 something cases. And that's why a lot of people don't talk about hazing. Like, the hazing stories you're starting to see, there's a lot more hazing reporting now than in the past. And a lot of the stories are of colleges, are of the military. Like, you hear about the Adam Oakses, the Piazzas, the Tim Piazzas, the Colin Wyants, the Fat Nguyen's. Like, you hear about these kids because they're dying in colleges because of the hazing that goes on there. And that's a good thing that we're reporting about it. And it's very sad that we have to hear these types of stories. High school cases don't come out a lot because of multiple things. One, high school students are juveniles. Right. So according to the law, their names don't come out.
Right.
Which is why it's harder for me to find these cases, and a lot of people to find these cases. Two, they just don't talk about it. It's a smaller community a lot of the time. So it's just like, keep it within the community, keep it within the locker room. Do not speak about this. There's the amount of people I've actually reached out to is just incredibly, like, just the comparison with the people that actually spoke with me versus the people that just rejected me or didn't answer the phone or refused to talk to me. It's just like 1 to like 1,000. Like, even like my producer worked on a lot of great stories in the past with other podcasts and other, stations. And she was even surprised. Like, Iggy, why is no one talking to us? Like, no one wanted to pick up the phone. Even people that were victims, even people that I wasn't like trying to criticize. And at the same time, when I say that I don't want to criticize all perpetrators, because they might have just been caught in the cycle and a lot of people didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
But to the long, like, I already went on a tangent, but there is a code of silence, and it does create, because that code of silence is there, because it's constructed, this cycle is allowed to continue. It usually escalates until this one case actually happens. And the code of silence is there because of fear of retaliation or tradition or just the desire to be accepted, basically. I hope that answered your question. I'm sorry for not being succinct.
No, bro, this is awesome. If I'm all about the tangents myself, so this is great.
I'm a big tangent person. I have to always apologize to my producer. I talk too much. I know it.
No, bro, this is fantastic. And there's so much there too that we could probably explore and talk for another hour. But I want to move on to the topic of the video, because as you mentioned, this was captured and it was spread on social media. Unfortunately, I saw the clip. I don't recommend, as you said from the top there, I don't recommend people go and watch it. I caught maybe a couple of seconds, maybe let's say 10 seconds, and it's brutal. It's an all-out assault. I'm surprised he's still alive, because in that sort of scenario, when you have all these people twice, much bigger than you, jumping on you 3 times or so, the full body. How much does it take to actually permanently end someone's life? I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but I'm just saying, when you watch the video, it's shocking. It's shocking, and you begin to ask yourself, when it comes to hazing, how does having a video, documentation, how does that change the conversation around hazing? And the follow-up here is, would addressing the issue of hazing be less important if there was no evidence available, if it was just, hey, I just got beat up in the locker room, as opposed to, hey, I have the footage here, you need to see this? So how does that change it?
That's an interesting question, just in general, with any type of like abuse that happens in the world. Like, even like, just think about Eric Garner's case. I'm not sure if you remember Eric Garner in New York with the police. Yeah. People were talking, the only reason people talked about Eric Garner, and the only people they talked about, like, I can't breathe, is because there was a video of it. The only person that got prosecuted for what happened to Eric Garner was the guy who shot the video, which is just a tangent I don't need to go into. I'm just angry about it. But the thing is, a lot of times people won't prosecute unless there's some photographic or video evidence. Now, even outside of prosecution, people don't usually start these longer or bigger conversations unless there's that evidence, which is kind of a sad thing. But at the same time, it's either he say, she say, he say, he say, she say, she say, or they say, or it's, here's the evidence and here's proof. Now, I would say I never actually got this question, so I'm actually trying to think about it at the same time to formulate an answer. The interesting thing is, yes, there was video evidence, so there's actual proof that he got abused, which helped, prosecute some of the kids that were perpetrators. At the same time, that video was used for the aftermath period that we were talking about before. So you can say, yeah, there was video evidence that helped him in his case, because they can prove, look what happened in the locker room. This is the locker room. They're wearing the shorts of the team. You can't say this didn't happen. At the same time, that video is getting passed around social media, getting posted, getting talked about, and some people are being like, hey, bro, why are you talking about this, man? Why are you snitching? Or why are you being soft? Or why is your parents talking on the news because of this video? So it was used, it was both helpful and beneficial for like their larger case, but at the same time, it led to a lot of more bullying, a lot more harassment, and a lot more of that just mental trauma. At the same time, this is the interesting thing that I want to talk about, that I think your question is leading me towards. It's going to be something we talk about in the 5th episode about like response. One expert we talked to, Professor Eric Anderson, he brought up this point that I don't know why I didn't think about this earlier. I had like ideations of this slightly, But the thing that was interesting that he said is that maybe we're seeing a time where people are less stigmatized to be a victim. So if you look at the cases, a lot of experts will say hazing is happening more now. There's a lot more cases now. The lawsuits are showing up more now. So that must possibly mean, they won't say this 100%, but they'll possibly mean that there's more hazing now, or at least more violent hazing. Someone like a Susan Lipkins, Hank Newer would say that. But like for me, my question was always, how do we actually know that? Maybe people in the past, before social media, before videos and all that stuff, people in the past just kept it quiet. Maybe it was more accepted to keep it quiet. Maybe there was no one like to really like report this to. Now everyone can just have a phone and just post it. At the same time, there's also people that are coming out without videos or without photos. More people are talking about it. So maybe we live in an era. We live in like the Me Too era. We live in the I Can't Breathe, like George Floyd era. We live in an era where people are asking questions about prior misbehavior or prior traditions or rituals or just lifestyles and status quos that maybe we should be questioning and maybe we should be re-examining. And maybe hazing is that too. So there's a lot of people now, if you look at the database, if you look at all the cases recently, there's a lot more cases in just even the last 10 years, not even just the 2000s, not even just the 21st century. A lot of cases just within the last 10 years, in the last 5 years, last year, more than there were like in the 1900s, just for the fact that possibly people are not as stigmatized as being a victim. They're not as scared of coming out and talking about what happened to them. So whether that's with video evidence or not. But the video thing can lead me to like the social media thing. Like people talking about social media can also talk about like this stigma, which is really interesting. So I can go into like a lot of different tangents there, but that's like the main probably 2 points that I wanted to bring up with that question.
You know, with the video, and I appreciate your answer there. With the video, I think it's, I'm not trying to by no means encourage people to go and watch it, but it's shocking because, you know, it's a 14-year-old getting, you know, viciously attacked by a bunch of other kids as well, because these are teenagers, right? And you think about like just that level, that amount of violence, and people might have different definitions that you speak about, you know, bullying, the different definitions of hazing, but you know, in terms of bullying and so on, it's a vicious beating. And what crossed my mind is, what if they had killed him right there and then? What if they hit him so hard, or you know, he had a concussion. I think I have a quote here, something to be a concussion, a broken arm, and even had to have his braces rewired. I mean, this is it's straight up, it's an assault, you know, it's a vicious assault. Leading into my next question here, obviously it can be very hard to hear stories like these, you know, from victims and their families, as well as the pain and trauma they've endured and are still enduring. This is probably going to, for some of these victims and their families, it's going to be with them, unfortunately, for the rest of their lives. Why is it crucial to share the perspective of those who've experienced these traumatic incidents? Why, you know what I mean? I think I know the answer, but I'm curious to know, as you've been researching this topic and you've been interviewing all sorts of people, why is it important to hear from the victims?
I'll say a couple things to that. One of the things as a journalist in general, whenever you're covering trauma or just abuse, you're supposed to try as like there was a trauma reporting manual that I literally tried to follow, because one of the things I really don't want to do is just commercialize or capitalize on someone else's trauma or abuse. I don't want to be like, oh, I'm just going to put a camera here or put a microphone here and be like, I'm going to use you and your past terrible experience, your lowest points, for my gain. And in a way, I am, unfortunately, and I feel guilty about that. But I'm trying to use their story to start a conversation that we're not really having. Like, hey, again, like going back to the preconceptions, hazing, in my mind, before I heard this story about Rodney and before I looked at the other cases, I was thinking about Animal House. I was thinking about John Belushi. I was thinking about Will Ferrell in Old School. I was thinking about maybe you've seen like the video of Anthony Davis at the University of Kentucky, or Shaq's stories back when he was hazing, or JJ Redick and Hugh Turkoglu, like, or like Hard Knocks, like people seeing hazing on Hard Knocks, or like when people shave people's heads. Like, it doesn't, hazing sometimes has this preconception of it's not that bad. And then you look at these cases and it's like, wait, there's sometimes where it does go too far, and that always leads to the question of, is hazing okay? Is it acceptable? Is it ever acceptable, or is it always going to cross the line? At the same time, I don't want to reopen scars that people took a lot of time to try to seal up. So again, like Rodney and the Kims are not the only victims I reached out to. And I want to stress, I didn't only reach out to the victims that you heard in episode 1. I talked to people who did this to Rodney, but they also had to go through the hazing themselves because it's the cycle. Right. And then I tried to talk to coaches. I tried to talk to victims. I tried to talk to parents. I even talked to a presidential candidate who's trying to work on ending hazing, specifically with universities, not high schools. But a lot of the victims I spoke with, like, for example, there was one family that literally said, we don't want to reopen this. Like, actually, a lot of families kept saying, like, we don't want to go back into this. And I accept that because I don't want to re-traumatize anybody. There's a mother you're going to hear from in episode 5 who lost her son because of what possibly the effects of what happened after hazing. I'm not going to say there's a direct link. Yeah, suicide. Now, there's no, like, obviously direct link, but that's what the family goes back to. And it was also covered on ESPN. I want to give them, like, their credit because I don't want to say I'm the only one that did this. But, like, I didn't want to reopen a scar for her. I didn't want to re-traumatize her. I didn't want to put her back. And one of the rules I gave for myself was I wasn't going to go back to any store or reach out to any family prior to 2010, because people before the decade, it's just so far back. And maybe if I'd give myself a limit, it would help. I broke that rule once for the last episode, because the last episode is basically, to put it in one word, is about closure and about moving on. We can talk about that afterwards, but I didn't want to re-traumatize her. But she's like, she wanted to talk about her son, and she wanted to talk about what happened to her son and what happened at the school, because she's trying to change the world in a way. I'm not trying to say, like, we're doing much change. I'm a journalist. I'm not an advocate, but it does create a conversation that doesn't really happen much. I don't really hear conversations about hazing. And one of my goals with this series, as you'll see past episode 1, because episode 1 is kind of voyeuristic. I wanted to put, this is what happened. This is what it can look like. The rest of the series, I'm trying to make it as much not a true crime series. I'm trying to make it more of a, here are different narrative threads that you can look into to try to understand this bigger theme of hazing. So we look into parenting, and we look into coaching. Like, what is the role of a coach? We look into, what is the line? We look into response. Like, is there any way to stop hazing? What have people tried in the past? We look into, like I said, closure and community retaliation. Where I'm trying to start a conversation rather than just make this a true crime, just point a camera or a microphone there and be like, hey, look at this terrible thing that happened. Like the famous line in the news industry that I was taught from a very young age in classes is that if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
Like, that's the famous thing you hear in the news, especially with broadcast journalism. Like, if you look at A blocks, B block, and C block on the news, you'll see A block, here's all these terrible news that happens. Here's all this, like, someone died or there was an attack or whatever. That's always going to lead the news. Like, even when you, like, I brought up George Floyd before, like, really quickly. If you look at George Floyd's news, they covered it for like 2 weeks, the protest, and then they covered the protest, and then they just move on to the next thing. They didn't really, like, try to cover what happened in the aftermath of that. Like, what is changing? Or is it just like, here's a moment in history and then we move on? I didn't want to do that. I wanted to create a conversation. So I hope that answers your question. I still struggle with this because I do feel guilty in a way. As a journalist, a lot of times when you focus on stories of trauma, you're going to have to ask difficult questions. I had to ask Rodney what happened that day. I had to ask him about his mental trauma, and that brought up, like, a lot of his pain. I had to ask the mother that I brought up about her son who died. And I actually asked 2 mothers about their sons who died. Like, I don't want to ask those questions, but in a way, I feel like if I'm going to tell this story, and if I'm going to tell this story the right way, and if the goal really is to start that conversation about what is hazing and why do we do it and what it says about us as Americans, then I have to ask those questions.
Absolutely, man. I think you're doing important work, and you're asking these tough questions. No one would be comfortable asking these questions, but they need to be asked because there's a lot of abuse unfortunately in sports, and you're exploring the theme of hazing, which, to be honest, before even hearing this podcast, of course, I went to high school. I'm familiar with bullying in general, bullying in sports. Yes, so what? But this is a whole different beast, and it's one that's aspects of that culture, I suppose, is possibly ingrained within sports, and it's not spoken about because, as you mentioned, there's a code of silence, right? So, and that
Mhm.
adds to this cycle of violence where the victims become the perpetrators down the road, which leads to my next question. I'm curious to know, you interview and you allow the victims to share their side of it, to share their story, but you also allow the perpetrators to speak and to tell their story. Why is that important? Why is it important to hear from the perpetrators?
Well, like I said before, they also had to go through that cycle, like you just said. They also had to go through some type of hazing or some type of locker room culture or whatever you want to call it. Again, everyone will argue about what the word hazing means. It doesn't matter if you call it whatever. Let's call it hazing for the sake of like semantics. They also had to go through it. They also had to go through the cycle. And I don't think anyone there, especially at least the kids I talked to, I don't think anyone wanted to actually hurt Rodney. I don't think their intent was to, I'm actually going to break bones. Like, it's brutal. The video is brutal. And when you watch the video, like you said you did, you might not think that's what their intention was. It looks like they were trying to hurt this kid as badly as possible. But from speaking with them and just from seeing all these different cases, a lot of the times they didn't want to hurt these people. I don't think, like, the one expert I talked to, I love this guy, Ricky Jones, who's a professor at Louisville, who also went through hazing in the Naval Academy as well as in college. So he was both the hazed as well as the perpetrator too. He said, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, I don't think any hazers wake up in the morning wanting to hurt anybody. Like, I don't think that actually happens where it's like, oh, I'm going to hurt somebody. It's more so just the cycle.
Mm.
And hazers are not, like, the interesting thing about hazers versus like bullies or any other abusers. Hazers can be anybody, anybody. It can be your captain. It could be your valedictorian. It could be an honor roll student. It could be like like a community service member. Like, it doesn't mean like, oh, that guy's like a bad, like one of the, I never used this term ever in my life until like this expert said, but like, that person's not a bad egg. It's not like, oh, someone that's like flunking out of school or just breaking the law all the time. It could be literally anybody. I wanted to talk to the perpetrator because they had to go through it too. I wanted to know why they did it. I wanted to know what was their intentions. And I also wanted to know, like, I wanted to answer the question, like, why Rodney? Because again, when you look at the video and you hear about the other cases, like, why did you do this to Rodney more than any, like, why did you hurt Rodney and you didn't hurt the other people as much as Rodney? There's other videos from Davidson too, but Rodney's case looked specifically different. And I just wanted to know why. So there's multiple things I wanted to go through there. I mean, one thing I tried to stress to the perpetrators as well as like to other people, I'd love to say, is that, I mean, you'll hear a little bit about this in episode 2. I was also hazed, and I've hazed others too. I had to go through, not in high school, I'll say that, but like in college, I was in a fraternity for a year, but I was both the hazer and the person that was hazed. And there was also, going back to like the semantics of the word and what is hazing, back in middle school, like, this didn't make into the series, but this goes back to the question of what is hazing and what is the spectrum of hazing, what fits in that spectrum. In middle school, I was part of a middle school fight club for 7th and 8th grade.
Wow.
Like, we would set up fights. And it was always like, oh, this kid has beef or has problems with this kid and they have beef with each other. Let's set up a fight every Friday in the park. You guys are going to fight and we're going to all come watch. And my question to experts and people I told the story was that hazing? Like, were we hazing each other? And from what I can tell, it wasn't hazing in our peer review. It was just like, oh, let's just squash the beef. At the same time, there were some kids that were part of those fights more than others. And some of those kids weren't part of our group, right? They weren't part of like my social group. So maybe they were part of those fights. Maybe they were trying to introduce themselves into these fights because they wanted to be accepted by our social group. So maybe it might not be hazing for me, but it might have been hazing for that kid down the road. So I think everyone's point of view matters in this story. That's why I tried to talk to, like I said before, I talked to perpetrators, victims, parents, coaches. I tried to talk to school officials. I talked to presidential candidates. I talked to experts because, first off, there's never one story or never one perspective in any story. There's usually not just two. There's usually so many sides. And you try to just understand. And the other thing about this, before I said, what does it say? What does hazing say about us? And what does it say about America? Hazing is not an American thing. It's, or at least when I say that, it's not only in America. I found stories in the Philippines, in Australia, in Canada. the reason I say, what does it say about America? One of the things that's very intriguing to me about the American culture is that we love the status quo. We love tradition. And what does it say about us sometimes when we can't move on from stuff despite the abuse or despite the trauma that it causes? Like one other thing is like, not to say like whatever my position is, but gun culture, for example. There's a lot of school shootings, like what Rodney brought up. There's a lot of school shootings happening, but there's a lot of times you'll hear people, we can't move on from that. That's what we've always, like, there's always been the Second Amendment. That's always who we are. So we can't move on from that. And it's the same thing with hazing in a way. It's like some communities are like, that's just a tradition. It's not that bad. Like, why are you going to move on from that when this is what we've always done? So that's like just a perspective that I wanted to key into a little bit more. So even with the perpetrators, they had to go through it. And they also did this to this kid. I don't think they meant to go that far, but they did. And they had to deal with what happened afterwards, the consequences of that too. So do I support what they did to Rodney? Absolutely not. That was criminal behavior. But do I think they meant to do that? No. And I wanted to know why they did that and what they had to go through themselves. I think the cycle is something that people need to understand more. And people need to just see, like Jakyle, for example. Jakyle went to prison. Jakyle was a prospect, it looked like. He could have been a prospect, 6'3", 235 pounds, I think. He could have been like a football player. And football for him was his way out. And that's another conversation that Americans don't like to have. They don't like to go into a lot, is just the relationship between sports and who we are, specifically with certain communities, because that's like the only way out for some kids. But he lost that too. They both, that was like the parallel I wanted to key into as well. Rodney lost his career, his dreams. So did Jakyle.
I zoned in on that right away, in fact, and I think this is the other issue I find, is that there is no real value to hazing ultimately. You know what I mean? Nobody wins. I mean, everyone seems to get traumatized. We can use that word because, I mean, look at, how they're feeling, the families, the victims, etc. But even the perpetrators, in this case here, he loses out on his opportunity for education, in terms of college, in terms of competing or playing professional, and so on. And it's a lose-lose situation. Nobody
but
wins.
I'll say this, that's only because the story came out, and that's only because Rodney got hurt that the story came out. There's a lot of people where the story didn't come out that they'll say, like, even in like college life, people will say, oh, the hazing helped us bond. You're manufacturing trauma so that you can manufacture a bond and chemistry with each other. And that helped win some games, or that helped, I don't know, get a job in the future. Some people will say that hazing actually worked. And some people say hazing will bond us. But that's also because it didn't cross a certain line for them, or it didn't go too far, or they were able to like suppress the trauma and just move on. So you're right, but that's only because the story came out. There's a lot of people where stories don't come out, and some people will be like, no, I won from hazing. But the question is that okay?
Right. And I mean, the entire sports, quote unquote, ecosystem, what does it value from that? Because in this case here, we have high school students. Not all high school students will go on to play in college, and not all college students will go on to play professionally. And sports, it's not just about making it to the professional league. People play sports in high school for a variety of different reasons, right? And I mean, I think the culture, it's about protecting athletes as well, I think, to some extent, and it's easy for me to say this as a grown-ass man. I'm 41 years old, I'm a parent. And if I saw something like that happen in a locker room, I would imagine someone else my age would probably jump in and try to break it up. But as a 14-year-old, I'll be honest with you, man, as a 14-year-old, and I'm not trying to point fingers at anybody here, but by the way, I'm listening to this and I'm trying to somewhat remain objective, but I'm like, man, as a 14-year-old, we've seen bullying before. We've seen people get I've seen that, and it's so this is what I'm saying. It's like, it's almost like nobody wins from this. And I kind of wonder what's the expected outcome in terms of what's a proactive way of addressing this sort of behavior. And my initial reaction is about, well, it's the coaching staff. What are the trainers? What are they, because they set the tempo, they set, I would imagine, they set the culture within a team. They're the leaders, right? And I'm speaking even at a recreational level here. not just organized football, but any sport really. I think a lot of, you know, the real decision making and the driving of the culture, I think, is the leadership. Who's running the show, and how much do they know, and how much are they willing to kind of create an inclusive, safe environment for your athletes, man, to develop and grow as men and women, etc. You know what I'm saying? Like it's so there's a lot there. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just agreeing with you. I mean, that's going to be something the coaching staff and leadership and the adult supervision is something we're going to be talking about in the third episode, because like you said, they're kids, and there is an adult. There is supposed to be a coach. There's supposed to be an adult supervisor there with these kids. Now, I'll say this. There is no, like I said, hazing is a spectrum. The cases are almost always different from each other. They have a lot of similarities, but there's some stories where like coaches are literally not in the room, or they just got hired and they just like essentially inherited the hazing culture. Or like, again, the other thing that's interesting about this whole thing that sometimes I have to remind myself is high school and colleges and all this stuff, it's 4 years. You get a new class every time. So the culture might have been laid there and just constructed and cultivated by somebody that's not even there anymore. Coaches also have their own spectrum of responsibility too. At the same time, there's coaches that know about the culture and condone it and allow it to happen, either because like, oh, we're trying to build gladiators, or we're trying to build someone that's like toughen them up for the sport, or they think like, oh, this is just kids being kids, and they didn't think it was going to escalate to a certain point. They just thought they were just playing around, and then it just got to a point. And sometimes the coaches are just oblivious to what's happening, and I think those coaches maybe need to do a better job at coaching or not be coaches. There's a coach we talked to, or I talked to in the Bronx, who had a 30-year career coaching high school football and track and field. And he said the main reason he retired, and I didn't know this when I started interviewing him, I just saw that he talked about hazing in the past. He said the main reason he retired after 30 years is because he was scared someone was going to accuse him of having hazing culture in his locker room. Not that it was there, but just the fact that he was scared that someone was going to accuse him of that, which is such an interesting point of view that I didn't even think about going into that interview. It's coaches know about hazing. They might not talk about it with their students. A lot of students, Susan Lipkins, one of the experts I spoke with, she said a lot of the coaches she spoke with said that over a whole season or a whole academic year, coaches might spend 30 seconds or a minute or maybe 30 minutes at most with students or student athletes to talk about hazing, and then they move on. Most people don't talk about it. It's just not, they don't consider it part of their job. But then there's some coaches that think like they just allow it to happen. Like you can look at, like there's one case I really, really wanted to go into, and we did interviews for, and I wanted to do more and I wanted to go into, but it just in the end we had to cut it. But like Mater Dei High School in California, I'm not sure if you know about the school, #1 football program in the United States for multiple years, created, or is the school that's like credited for 3 Heisman winners, which is the most in high schools: Bryce Young, Matt Leinart, and there's a third one and I'm forgetting, so apologies. But they're credited for like all these wins and all these great prospects that come out of there. They have currently, I think, 3 hazing scandals that are going on, among other scandals within the school, but sports rule the roost there. Coaches are a very interesting concept about this, because unlike Greek life, for example, Greek life, you just have the members, the fraternity members there. In high school sports, college sports, whatever sports, you have a coach that's supposed to be supervising. So the question is, what is their role when hazing happens, and what is the consequences if something happens there? Like it changes each time, so there's not one binary black and white answer, but it's definitely an interesting concept. Like you said, like there's supposed to be good leadership, there's supposed to be culture that's established there to try to prevent this type of behavior from happening. But a lot of people will say kids are going to be kids. Maybe it happens even if I'm trying. You know, it's hard. You're not in the locker room, so it's hard.
Very true. And I think this leads to my last question for you, Iggy. I really appreciate this interview.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. And I'm really looking forward to the next episode and seeing what you guys make out of this, because I think you really are creating this conversation and educating us on it. And for me, again, this was not on my radar. I've heard about, other issues within sports and so on in terms of other forms of abuse, but not this, especially at that high school level. Last question for you. What do you say to individuals who argue that hazing is a rite of passage and a necessary part for masculine identity? And how do you respond to the boys will be boys and tough guy narratives that we often find in our culture here in North America, but it's everywhere, right? This tough guy masculine identity, and this is how you become a man. You go through this rites of passage where you get stomped on and beaten by your peers, which I laugh at, but it's not a laughing matter, obviously. But what are your thoughts on that? What do you?
It's something you hear a lot. You'll hear kids being kids, boys being boys. You hear that this is going to toughen you up a lot. Not that everyone I talk to says that because they mean it or they that's their intention. Sometimes you just hear that through like the reporting, the interviews and such. I think it's ridiculous. At least in the terms of toughen you up. I'll stick with Davidson here, the school that we saw in episode 1. Davidson had hazing culture at least sporadically, from what I could find, since 2005, at least. It didn't always happen from the people I talked to, but it happened multiple times throughout the 2 decades. Point is, or a decade and a half. Point is, not all those teams that hazed were winning. They weren't always winning games. So like the thing that people will usually think is like, oh, you're toughening them up, that means you're going to win games. We're doing this to win games. They don't always win games. There's plenty of schools that haze that don't win. It doesn't really toughen you up. It doesn't work, at least. If that's the reason you're doing it, you're not really doing it successfully. So there's no real reward from hazing all the time. But then there'll be like a school like Mater Dei, who's like the #1 school in the country, and people point to that like, oh, they're winning and they have hazing. So like maybe it does work. I'm like, that's not always what happens. Like Ricky Jones once told me that he got hazed, but like he doesn't think hazing helped him get smarter. He didn't think it helped him get like a degree. It just happened. So all of the reasons that people give for hazing, there's always like holes you can poke in it. I really, really, really wanted to do an episode about masculinity. I really wanted to stress masculinity. Again, it doesn't only happen to males. It doesn't only happen to boys. There's actually a study. There's not many studies on hazing, especially in high school, but there was a study that said, I think it was around between males and females, I think it was like 50 something, 55, 45 split, which is higher than I expected with females, actually, at least me personally. It just looks different. Females hazing usually, according to experts, deals with more with humiliation and more with like humiliation based on sex or weight or image. Male hazing is more dealt with violence. Why is it violent is the question. And Ricky Jones actually goes into this specifically within the Black Gaze. And it's something I would stress, read Black Haze by Ricky Jones. It's something that goes into, like, his thesis is more so about why is violence and why is hazing so tied to identities of masculinity, specifically within certain communities. And it's a very interesting read to understand or to go through. Some people, like you said, like they'll like toughen you up. Like when I was a kid, me and 2 of my cousins, like on one of my like parents' side, we used to like run around the house and wrestle with each other and roughhouse each other. Of like course, that was just something that we did. And we tied it to like, oh, trying to be like tough. Like it was like making us male. Like you can go to a basketball court and see like faux fights, not like real fights, but like faux, like slap boxing or shadow boxing or just anything along those lines, because it's so tied to our identity. And another expert we talked to, Eric Anderson, he talked about this idea of homohysteria that I can go into a giant tangent about. But there's this idea that people need to prove that you're not feminine or you're not homosexual or that you're not, like, you need to prove that you're strong and you're male. And this trope of like masculinity sometimes leads to this. It's not always toxic. I'm not going to like do this whole like thing about toxic masculinity, but there is masculinity tropes that lead into toxicity. And that could be like, oh, you're trying to be too tough, so you have to fight these people. Or someone bumps into you at a club, you have to fight them now because that's just the code of masculinity. You have to fight them at this point. Why is there a connection between violence and some tropes of masculinity? I can go into a whole like lecture about that. So I'm not sure how much you want me to go into that. I would stress reading Ricky Jones' Black Haze. I would stress reading Eric Anderson's study on homohysteria. There's a lot of other studies you can go into, but there is a connection between hazing and violence, specifically with males. It's very interesting. And a lot of it has to do with people just trying to prove that they're strong, people that are trying to prove that they have the authority around the totem pole, people that are trying to prove that they're not feminine or they're embarrassed. So they have to just pretend to do something. And why did I shadowbox or wrestle with my cousins? I thought it was just, growing up. I don't like, I could like dissect myself. Like, why did I even join sports? I love sports. I love playing baseball. I love playing basketball. I love playing football. I love playing soccer. I played cricket with my like some of my family members.
Wow.
I love sports, but why did I get attached to it as much? Like, what does that lead to, like ideas of masculinity? There's a lot of questions you can ask there that you can like dive into a giant rabbit hole. But no, it's an interesting question. There is definitely a link between violence and hazing and why we do it and why the male gender does it. And it has a lot to do with how we see our own identity. How do we define masculinity and define our own identity? It's a very big conversation to have that I'm not, stressing very efficiently right now. But it could just be forever at this point.
No, I hear you, man. And in terms of even the rough housing and all that, just what we all did as kids, play fighting and wrestling. I'll admit it. I to some degree, I still do that. I'm still a fan of that. As, you know what I'm saying? And even like, and I'm by no means associating that, just putting it out there, associating that with hazing per se, but I could see how things can go very far, very fast in an organized way where it becomes hazing. So it's giving me something to think about,
All it takes is one case. All it takes is one time. And then like all the fun you're having, all the wrestling, I'll tell you, like the fight club I told you about in my class in middle school. There was one kid that I remember, he reminded me that he tripped, or one of the kids reminded me that he tripped and fell on a rock, or he fell and his head almost hit a rock. Like if he got hurt, if he died, like what would people call that? What we did was wrong. It could have been one time, and that's like your story now. You don't get a new story. You don't get a new perspective. One thing we didn't get to talk about it in the podcast, but it's really interesting, and I stress listeners to think about this sometimes, is the idea of sanctioned versus unsanctioned violence. It's very interesting to me. Like, we sanction violence sometimes. We sanction on a football field. You're supposed to hit each other. That's the game. You're supposed to run into each other and hurt each other and tackle each other. Maybe not hurt each other outside a bounty gate, but like you're supposed to hit each other hard. Even like in wrestling or rugby or whatever, boxing, like MMA, UFC, that's sanctioned. We allow that to happen because entertainment and sport and just athleticism and such. But then there's certain locations. As soon as you leave that football field and go to the locker room, now it's suddenly unsanctioned. Neil Brennan is this comedian, really good comedian. He talked about this idea of like, you're telling football players, like there's a lot of stories of a lot of NFL players that get in trouble, or even college players that get in trouble because they'll have like a violent, like you think like the Ray Rices, the Greg Hardys that got in trouble for like hitting their wives or girlfriends or such. They're suddenly doing what they've been taught all their lives to do, which is to be violent, which is what made them successful, which is to be violent. And then they're suddenly doing it in an unsanctioned place. Should they have done it? Absolutely not. I'm not defending that at all. They should. That's like criminal behavior, but it's a very interesting concept. It's like, where do we sanction this violence? And some people do sanction hazing. Like we're talking about like condoning it with like coaches or like communities and such. So this idea of like, where do we sanction it and where do we unsanction it? Where is it legitimate and where is it illegitimate? It's a very interesting conversation we can also go into for like a very long time.
You know what, man? We're gonna have to have you back on, in a couple of weeks or so. Once the entire series is out, because I'm gonna be listening to for part 2. I believe it comes out tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Yeah. So maybe by the end, and it's a 6-part series, correct?
Yeah. 6 episodes.
But by the end of episode 6, I'm probably going to reach out to you again for a follow-up interview. I'll have lots of questions. Thank you very much for joining us, folks. If you want to check out the podcast, Roughhousing, it's available wherever you get them. It's a collaboration between Religion of Sports and PRX and the PRX team. Do you have any last things you want to share with us?
Thank you for having me so much. I really appreciated this conversation. Sorry for going on tangents, but just check it out. Check out the series anywhere you listen to podcasts, and just start having this conversation. Just think about like when you were a kid in high school, middle school, college, like what did you have to do to fit in, basically?
Mm.
And like maybe you were a part of hazing, maybe you have your own stories. And if you have stories you want to tell me about, hit me up. I am building this database. I will keep building it. Um, I think I don't think people are bad people for taking part in hazing. I think it's just something that we need to re-examine and just start re-examining your own childhood. This is something that forced me to remember some of those moments, whether it's the Fight Club or college and such. So I would just say re-examine your own coming of age story, your own growing up wherever you're from type of story. And yeah, listen to the podcast. I appreciate everything. And thank you so much for having me on here and having this conversation.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Hey, take care, my man.